After he finished writing the script to Apocalypse Now, writer John Milius boldly stated that it would be the most violent movie ever made. However, the finished film is anything but, as it transformed into a psychedelic and surreal fever dream that explored the madness of the Vietnam War. And that change is due to director Francis Ford Coppola taking over the project, or stealing it, depending on who you ask, from his friend George Lucas, who had originally planned to direct Milius' script. So let's dive in and find out how Coppola came to direct it, and also take a look at what could have been George Lucas' version of Apocalypse Now. Milius first got the idea to try and adapt Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness when his USC screenwriting professor Irwin Blacker told the class that many filmmakers had tried to make it, but nobody could lick it. Even the great Orson Welles had tried and failed. To Milius, this was like waving a red flag in front of a young bull, as he immediately set out to break the curse and make Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness takes place on a steamer going up the Congo River during the 1890s. But when Milius began planning to adapt the novella, the war in Vietnam was raging, as the word coming back from returning soldiers was that it was unlike any war that had come before. This gave him the idea to do Heart of Darkness in Vietnam. While Milius collected stories and made notes, an unlikely friendship formed on the set of Finian's Rainbow between director Francis Ford Coppola and Milius' classmate, George Lucas, who was there on a student scholarship off the strength of a short film, THX 1138. However, Coppola was happy to have him there, since not only was Lucas the only other person near to him in age and with a beard, but Coppola's experience directing Finian's Rainbow was a miserable one, as he was forced to shoot most of it on the leftover and fake-looking Camelot sets instead of out on location like he wanted. After the film wrapped, Coppola and Lucas decided to join forces and make films outside the studio system, where they would have the freedom to make them the way they wanted. They'd call their company American Zoetrope. However, they needed money to finance it, so Coppola, rather brilliantly, turned to Warner Brothers, who not only previously produced Finian's Rainbow, but had just gone through a regime change, and pretended that the previous regime agreed to finance the feature film version of Lucas' short film, THX 1138. On the new regime's first day in the office, Coppola sent them a note, saying he and Lucas were waiting for their go-ahead to begin shooting, so they better shape up or ship out. Luckily for Coppola, following the success of Easy Rider, studios realized they were out of touch with the emerging counterculture generation, and eagerly looked to hire young filmmakers, hoping to replicate Easy Rider's success. As a result of this, Warner Brothers cut a deal with Zoetrope, where they agreed to finance a slate of 7 pictures to be made by Coppola, Lucas, and their film school friends without any interference from Warner Brothers, while Coppola would oversee the whole thing. Included in this package of 7 films were Lucas's THX 1138, which would be the first film made in the deal, Coppola's The Conversation, and an idea by John Milius that Lucas would direct as a second film after he finished THX called Apocalypse Now. Lucas was heavily inspired by the film The Battle of Algiers, which was shot on 16mm black and white in a pseudo-documentary style on location with non-professional actors to enhance the film's realism. For Apocalypse Now, Lucas wanted to do the same thing. Interestingly, Lucas's buddy Spielberg would eventually do something similar when making Saving Private Ryan, as he tried to emulate the look of World War II footage shot by combat cameramen. Milius wanted to take Lucas's idea one step further and actually shoot the film in Vietnam. He get this idea from Medium Cool, featuring a young Robert Forster, which was also shot in a documentary style during the actual protests outside the 1968 Democratic National Convention. However, after Warner Brothers saw a cut of THX, they realized it was about the furthest thing from Easy Rider and took the picture away from him, recut it, and then canceled their deal with Zoetrope before demanding Coppola return all of the money. As Lucas began shopping the Apocalypse Now script to other studios, he sent future Star Wars producer Gary Kurtz to the Philippines to scout locations. The idea was to film most of the movie there, in the rice fields between Stockton and Sacramento, California, as well as send a small second unit crew from Japan into Vietnam to capture footage of the actual war, which would be intercut with the rest of the film. Lucas's goal was to make you forget you were watching a movie. He wanted you to feel like you were actually there, in the jungle, in the line of fire, and face to face with the horrors of war. And while Lucas's direction is heavily criticized today, following his work on the prequels, back then he was a leading experimental filmmaker, and I have no doubt he could have pulled it off. Unfortunately, every studio turned Lucas down, as the war in Vietnam was not only still going, but was incredibly divisive too, as studios felt it was far too sensitive a topic to make a film about. After the commercial failure of THX, Coppola challenged Lucas to go out of his comfort zone and make a film that would appeal to mainstream audiences. The result would be American Graffiti, as Lucas would make that as a second picture and put Apocalypse Now on the shelf for the time being. But besides how Lucas would have shot Apocalypse Now, how different would his version have been? According to Gary Kurtz, Milius' original script contained a lot of dark humor and more closely resembled something like MASH. And while there's a long-standing myth that Coppola heavily rewrote Milius' script, script, an accusation made by Milius himself, who criticized Coppola for wanting to ruin it, liberalize it, and turn it into Hair. Milius' first draft contains all of the same iconic moments as the final version of the film, like the Ride of the Valkyries, the Playboy Bunnies, and the entire Colonel Kilgore sequence, although he was originally named Colonel Carnage.
And people always say, well, what part is your original? I said, all the parts you liked.
The ending, however, was totally different, and originally featured Kurtz meeting Willard as he arrives at the compound before taking him on a guided tour. The tour is abruptly cut short, though, as Kurtz and Willard prepare for an impending North Vietnamese attack, before they team up to fight them off, as Kurtz is killed in the firefight. As American rescue helicopters are drawn to the battle, Willard goes mad and shoots directly at them as he resists being rescued. This version of Kurtz is different too, and is described as a mediocre commanding officer gone mad with power, and that power is the ability to call in airstrikes at will, which the indigenous people see as a god summoning fire from the sky. Coppola changing both Kurtz's characterization as well as the ending to the one we all know is likely what Milius hated the most, as he'd go on to sarcastically accuse Coppola of seeing himself as a great humanitarian and an enlightened soul who will tell you such wonderful things as he does at the end of The Godfather 2, that crime doesn't pay. However, Coppola would hit back and defend the change to the ending, saying that the script was little more than a one-dimensional expression of Milius' Neolithic jingoism, as it continued through comic strip episode and comic strip episode until it came to a comic strip resolution, which Coppola not only felt was cartoonish, but worried Brando, who showed up to set horribly overweight, was too fat to play the scenes as written. Coppola had also made the film more surreal, and felt that a big battle for the ending didn't work with the new tone of the film he had established. The most significant change to Milius' script was the voiceover narration, which was added in post. Once the film was cut together, editor Walter Murch felt it lacked structure, so Coppola hired Michael Herr to rewrite it after reading his book Dispatches about Herr's experiences in Vietnam as a war correspondent. Herr's narration gives the film an intimacy that otherwise wouldn't have existed, as we experience the film through Willard's eyes, humanizing him as we hear his changing thoughts and feelings on the journey up the river. Milius also wrote the infamous French Plantation scene, which Coppola shot but cut from the theatrical version of the film to improve its pacing. Interestingly, this is one of the few changes Coppola made that Milius supported.
When I saw the movie, I said, boy, I'm glad that part's gone.
Dennis Hopper's character, the drugged-out American photojournalist, was also a Coppola addition. Originally, Hopper was supposed to play a special forces captain who had been sent to assassinate Kurtz before Willard, but who decided to abandon his mission and join Kurtz instead. However, in an effort to add a little bit more of the Heart of Darkness novella back into the film, Coppola changed the character, modeling him after the Russian from the novella. While Coppola returned to California during a break in filming, his editor Walter Murch suggested he add a My Lai-type massacre scene to the film. After returning to the Philippines, Coppola and the cast cooked up the puppy Sampan massacre, which they improvised on set. Milius, however, hated this scene and felt it was anti-American, but Coppola argued that it would be a loss of innocence for both the audience and the characters, who at this point in the film Coppola felt the audience liked. So to change that, he wanted to make them dirty. So how did we go from George Lucas directing the movie to Francis Ford Coppola? After going off to direct both Godfather films and The Conversation, Coppola returned to American Zoetrope, eager to revive his and Lucas's vision of making independent films outside of the studio system. Apocalypse Now was always the standout script from the group of those original 7 screenplays pitched to Warner Brothers, and Coppola felt a successful war movie, now that the war in Vietnam was over, would do big numbers at the box office, allowing him to use the profits to then fund Zoetrope's other small art films that they wanted to make. Determined to go ahead with Apocalypse Now, Coppola asked Lucas if he would direct it, but he was busy working on the Star Wars script, which Coppola didn't think much of, telling Lucas he was crazy when he could be directing Apocalypse instead. Milius, now an accomplished director himself, was busy with the project too and wasn't free to direct it. So Coppola decided to direct Apocalypse Now himself, but instead of doing it like Lucas as a low-budget black and white film in a pseudo-documentary style, he opted to make it a big-budget spectacle. However, Lucas felt he had a moral claim on the project and was allegedly only asked by Coppola if he was okay with him directing it after the project was already rolling, leaving Lucas with little choice but to say yes. Milius, on the other hand, sided with Coppola, insisting that Lucas never had anything to do with the film other than the fact that at one point he was going to direct it, feeling that Lucas had ample time to make it and never did. Milius and Coppola also accused Lucas of losing interest in the project after getting rich following American Graffiti, with Milius jokingly saying that there was no way Lucas still wanted to go shoot a movie in a jungle surrounded by poisonous insects. Interestingly, many of the themes from Apocalypse Now and the Vietnam War, like a small, resilient group of rebels overcoming a larger adversary, would find their way into the Star Wars script, as the Empire would would serve as a metaphor for America, while the rebels would draw parallels with the North Vietnamese. When Milius finally saw Apocalypse Now, he was so upset with the result that he reportedly put his fist through a door, feeling Coppola had ruined his script. Lucas didn't like it either, as he complained that he invested 6 years of his life into it, only to see his original concept distorted by Coppola's fervid imagination. Unfortunately for Coppola, not only would he be beaten to the punch by The Deer Hunter, which would win numerous awards, but Apocalypse Now also fell short of attaining the same success as his acclaimed Godfather films, with initial reviews being decidedly mixed. However, after its release, fans kept going back to see it, as the film would slowly make its money back and come to be reevaluated as a masterpiece. And while Milius and Coppola fought bitterly over the script, over time, as the film's reputation improved, Milius would have a change of heart.
And I really, really love the film. I think it's his best film. I certainly think it's my best piece of work, and really proud to have had anything to do with it.
Milius would go on to say that he and Lucas would have made a good movie together, but neither of them had Coppola's theatricality and showmanship, which is what ultimately set the film apart, as Coppola at the time was at the height of his powers. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Bullets and Blockbusters for more great content.